Oh, shit.
Oh, that's good. No.
What did I do?
Okay, I think we're all set to get started. Marcia, I have you pinned. Would you like to kick us off? Oh, you're just muted.
Nawang, I think Nawang is going to start.
Yeah, did you want to start now?
No, let's wait a few minutes because people are still coming in.
So there are two screens. What should I pin our panelists to?
People can hear us.
People can hear us, yes.
Try the chat. Oh, okay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome everyone to the Studio for Media Activism and Critical Thought's 6th annual speaker series. My name is Nawang, and I will be co-hosting today's event alongside SMACT studio manager Mel Racho and studio director Dr. Marussia Buzurka. SMACT was founded in 2015 as a site of activist and scholarly curation, discussion, and research, a place to imagine new and alternative forms of social justice media, and as an intervention into the neoliberal university. Our upcoming in-person event will take place on Thursday, April 7th at Glad Day Bookshop. We'll be hosting the annual Lab of Feminist Memory. This year's theme is Wartime Edition, and will feature performers such as Nurbise Philip, Charlie Petch, Jody Chan, Sarah Gadir Malik, and more. So please stay tuned for that event. And on to tonight's event. Today's event is called Complaint and the Neoliberal University. It's inspired by Sarah Ahmed's book, Complaint. First things first, we regret to inform you that Hayden King could not make it to the event tonight. but he has recorded a short talk for us, which we will play for you. We're also thrilled to share that Dr. Raven Sinclair will be joining us. Tonight's roundtable of academics and activists also include Amber Grant, Heather Mill, and Alison Brickey. The speakers will bring various complaints about debt, female labor, exploitation, and research funding to the table. We will also be reading some complaints submitted by Marussia students. Somewhere between a bitch session and a strategy session, this event will celebrate complaint as activism, as creativity, and as pedagogy. At the request of one of our participants, there will be no land acknowledgement tonight. We invite you to ponder the reasons for this, and we also encourage donation to the Wet'suwet'en Defense. There's a link in the chat for you. If you can donate, please do so. The event is being recorded and will be available on our website and our social media as of next week. And thank you to our tech assistant, Natalie, our social media assistant, Brianna, our graphic designer, Talveen, and SMACT manager, Mel Racho. And now I'd like to invite Marussia to say a few words.
Thank you, Nawang, and welcome everyone. What is your complaint? What happens when you complain? Have you experienced what Ahmed calls the wear and tear of coming up against them, the institution? In her 2021 book, Complaint, British feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed traces the various convoluted journeys that complaints can lead to within the space of the neoliberal university, the university that is focused on industry and market value. Those of us at SMACT have often felt the wear and tear of soliciting support for a precariously funded research center. This has given us the opportunity to ponder the meanings of academic freedom. If someone, say a newly hired assistant professor, wanted to start, say, a research center for intersectional feminism, and why not in a university where no such program exists, they would not know where to begin. There would be no application form, no guidelines. It would be a heavily concealed trail. They would have to navigate a gauntlet of administrators who may or may not be in sympathy with intersectional feminist research, or indeed know anything about it. They might feel chastened by language on the university's website, which hails research as part of, quote, a continued collaboration with industry and government partners, end quote. Perhaps you have already complained about racist harassment or about your exploitation as a sessional instructor. Perhaps you are a student complaining about a curriculum in which not a single female thinker, let alone a person of color, is included. Yes, this is still happening. Maybe you are beginning to feel like you, not the institution, is the problem. Ahmed points out that if you make a complaint, not only will it stick to you, it will be how you get stuck. This can be debilitating, but we have learned a lot about the mechanics of the university. We have studied its rhetoric, its market-driven, obfuscating language. We have institutional wisdom. Those who do not reproduce the system risk not progressing, says Ahmed. And this system demands to be reproduced. In the rhetoric of renaming, which is also the rhetoric of rebranding, in the recurring call for austerity when millions are spent on administrative salaries, the administration constantly spawning and reproducing itself with vice provosts and vice presidents. And this is truly a vice for sessional instructors who make up more than 60% of teaching faculty across Canada, continue to work for salaries that are disgraceful and a precarity that is nothing but cruel. Neoliberalism becomes, among other things, a loss of a sense of the possible. It seems impossible that this will ever change. But Ahmed ends her book with a chapter called Complaint Collectives. She writes, quote, "We sound louder when we are heard together. We are louder." And, quote, "There is an intimacy between how much we come to know and how we work together," end quote. In our 7 years of existence, SMACT has become a complaint collective, but these have not always been literal complaints. They've been interventions in the form of performances, films, lectures, workshops, even a death cafe. The neoliberal university brought me to this intimacy, this privilege of working with faculty and graduate students who come up against the wear and tear of the university all the time and yet are unafraid. My work with SMACT allows me to experience what Michel Foucault described as a heterotopia, quote, counter sites, a kind of inactively enacted utopia in which the real sites are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted, end quote. Neoliberalism currently manifested, among other things, in a brutal colonial war for market share for wheat and oil and land, destroys itself and others. But art and theory and activism are generative. They thought they could bury us, but we were seeds and we grew. I'm so excited to welcome Hayden King via recording, Raven Sinclair, Heather Milne, Alison Brickey, and Amber Grant to our imaginary roundtable, our ad hoc complaint collective. I look forward to them sharing their complaints and their wisdom. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Hayden King, who joins us via recording. Hayden King is Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Gitchismeen in Huronia, Ontario. In addition to joining the Department of Sociology at Ryerson, Dr. King is Executive Director of Yellowhead Institute and advisor to the Dean of Arts on Indigenous Education. Previously, Dr. King taught at McMaster University and the First Nations Technical Institute, and also served as Senior Advisor to the Ontario Government, Director of Research at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and Scholar in Residence at the Conference Board of Canada. He is among the noted Indigenous public intellectuals in Canada with his research and analysis on Indigenous politics and Canadian settler colonialism. He is also co-founder of the Ogima Mikana Project and co-host of the Red Road podcast. And now we're gonna, oh, there we go.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's nice to be here with you all, even if it is via remote or rather pre-recorded video talk. I had a scheduling challenge that I could not resolve, unfortunately, and so the organizers have been gracious enough to let me record this condensed version of the talk that I was originally planning to give. And yeah, I'm excited to be engaging with Ahmed's work and hope that this contributes to what I think will probably be an enriching conversation that maybe I can join with some of my panelists later. So there are many sites of complaint for Indigenous people in the neoliberal university. There's the marginalization of Indigenous bodies from campuses, erasure of Indigenous thought, hostility towards Indigenous pedagogy and methods, the land acknowledgement, which I have complained about to no end. But as I read Ahmed's work, and admittedly I need to read more, thank you for the introduction to this book, by the way, I was reflecting on one of the longest standing complaints, one that I assume is all fresh in our minds here at X University, and that's complaint about our name. Amid the stubborn commitment of the neoliberal university to what is effectively for-profit education, attacks on faculty and student support, and the at times harmful commitment to notions of individualistic academic freedom, principles of academic freedom, we, those who are committed to otherwise worlds and alternative education models, can feel despondent, even hopeless. How do those among us preoccupied and or committed to structural change wade through the nihilism generated by overwhelming forces of settler colonialism, capitalism, gender violence, and come out on the other side? Indeed, those of us who are complainers don't merely have to contend with disappointment. There's the wear and tear that Ahmed talks about, discipline, exclusion, harassment that accompanies complaining. Oftentimes, it is the university's own complaint infrastructure that's responsible for perpetuating and exacerbating those harms in the name of fairness and accountability. Most definitely, this was the case for those Indigenous students, staff, faculty, community members who for many years challenged the name of this institution, as well as the statue that accompanied it. Students dropped out of their programs and school altogether. Faculty were labeled as bad ahistorical scholars, and community members were even arrested and charged. And yet complaint, as the concluding chapter in Ahmed's collection asserts, can sometimes move something. Complaint can be pedagogy, to teach us about how the neoliberal institution operates. But complaint can also be a method for activists, and through it, help develop an understanding of how the university can be moved, even by degrees. There are lessons in transformation via conflict, an agonistic model of change. In the long history of Indigenous activism against the university's name, we can discern at least 4 phases, and this is my argument. First, complaint as process. Initially, and up until today, this includes meetings with students and administration, for instance, working groups, committees, and so on. Predictably, as Ahmed points out, these processes can suffocate complaint and have been successful, were successful at delaying the name change for a time, as they are designed to do, according to Ahmed. Second is complaint as dialogue. Without resolution via process, complaint as process, the discussion moves to the public square, to letters written by faculty, events and panels, the kind of speak against and in support of the university's name, the kind that speak against and in support of the university's name in the public square. Here, the university was able to cast doubt on the violence of Edgerton Ryerson. Edgerton, I'm not sure which it is. The university is able to cast doubt on his role. Was he or was he not responsible for genocide? Deferring to the bedrock principle of academic freedom, the university found refuge in doubt, in academic debate. Third is complaint as movement. Now, as the anger percolated in response to complaint as dialogue, students organized, and notably with allies, including and particularly Black students, the Indigenous Students Rising Collective put more sustained pressure on the university, making public demands and amplifying those demands through a variety of public channels and earning more support. And it's here in complaint as movement where the university pivoted. In response to increasingly collective complaint, or maybe complaint collectives, the university offered what Evelyn Hugh Duhart calls fire insurance, moderate concessions to prevent the place from being burnt down. These might include more student support, expanded curriculum, more EDI. In the case of the name and statue, it resulted in a plaque that aimed to amend Ryerson's record and then later a task force to study the name. I think this was ultimately meant to reroute complaint back to the first phase process and start the cycle again. But something else happened in this case. They didn't take out enough insurance, as it were, and really how could they, given the external pressures of the discovery of residential school graves in Secwepemc territory, which influenced the broader discussion. So we have complaint as consensus eventually. The last phase in the renaming campaign was a multi-pronged approach that included a process, dialogue, and provocation. Provocation included placing children's shoes at the base of the statue and physically tearing it down. Dialogue included op-eds, public letters from students, faculty, staff, and process included the Standing Strong Task Force on Ryerson's legacy. Each strategy existed in tension with the others, but they were also complementary, even if accidentally so. At the point of consensus, or the appearance of it, the university had no choice but to concede. This is a victory to celebrate in the face of the mostly overwhelming neoliberal university. It is an example of solidarity and effective strategy. And I want to hold it close to comfort me on those days I drift into nihilistic thinking. Nonetheless, it is a largely symbolic change. Symbols are powerful, but they can also be deceptive and offer a mirage of movement. The proliferation of Indigenous art on campus as an example. While students have been complaining for actual physical space, the university offers instead symbols of inclusion that ultimately make it appear responsive to the broader community. I call these 4 phases of negotiated transformation an agonistic model of change because the neoliberal university is challenged and even transformed, but ultimately in limited structural ways. And Ahmed's words here around complaint as method, as a way of thinking about what we get from complaint, even when we do not get through, quote, unquote, are insightful. Sometimes, despite not getting through, you can still get a lot, even if it's just a little bit of hope.
Thank you to Hayden, who will be watching this recording. He was my professor my first year, or my first semester at X and York, and he was remarkable then and remarkable now. So yeah, please engage with the material if you feel moved to do so in the chat. Also, our Q&As are open. I am now very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Raven Sinclair. Dr. Raven Sinclair is Cree, Saulteaux, Métis, and a member of George Gordon First Nation of the Treaty Number 4 area of southern Saskatchewan. She's a direct descendant of 2 signatories to Treaty 4. She's a professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Regina. Dr. Sinclair's academic interests include Indigenous knowledge and research methodologies, intergenerational trauma and recovery, communication theory and training, and racism and lateral violence intervention. Raven balances her academic work with public speaking and consulting in the areas of research, child welfare, legal issues, and film, TV, and theater. She is the director of There is a Truth to be Told, the 60s Scoop in Splutson, and an executive producer on Trouble in the Garden. She's currently working on the 6-part TV series for a popular TV streaming service and a theatrical production out of Toronto. She's also a mother to an amazing team. Please welcome Dr. Raven Sinclair.
Hi everyone. Tanteka kia noa kumaginako tkuapit lesiga son posekanachich oschinia kitatam skat noal. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Marussia, for getting in touch with me earlier today. And so I haven't had much time to think or prepare, but when I heard the topic, it was a bit of a no-brainer for a number of reasons. So my name is Raven Sinclair. I'm a professor of social work, University of Regina in Saskatoon. And I've been there for 17 years. Yeah, and I got a few stories to tell. So I just made a little sort of list here that I'll just use to guide my chatting. But I was thinking about complaint, and it's interesting because I've sat in a couple of webinars recently. One was on complaint, and the other one was Black while teaching. And of course, the issues are so similar when it comes to complaint and then university responses. And I was thinking back about one time early in my life before I even was finished my first undergraduate degree. I was working and had a complaint, and I remember the big boss saying that I just have to deal with it because life isn't fair. And fairness is something that's tossed around, and fairness is a technique, it's a tool, it's a strategy. And it's one that faculty of color, Indigenous people, students, people of color, just we hear this more and more because it's one of sort of the new strategies, and the strategies are always emerging. And so I have to use a hypothetical scenario for you. So I'm telling this on behalf of a friend. So student complaints, of course, many of us have, been confronted with those, often frivolous, just fabricated for a number of reasons. Why people do these things. Humans are frail. And as I've reflected on these issues, I think that I find solutions when I look at psychology theory and ego deficits, as well as there's some informative information under abuses of power. Um, is it social? Oh, it'll come to me. I'm getting old, so sometimes things just disappear and they come back. But sort of different personality disorders. So narcissistic personality disorder, and then the other one, antisocial. There it is, antisocial personality disorder. And sometimes, an interesting sort of mix, because these types of sort of ego deficits, which can be fairly severe, they can be fairly mild. Man, when they mix with power, it can be it can be just a firestorm. And so in this particular story, student complaints after a mobbing intervention by this professor. And then the department head acted as judge and jury and imposed discipline without due process, which ultimately was really an opportunistic moment to piggyback their personal resentment on from several years prior onto the current student complaints. And so by denying any due process, then they were able to inflate and capitalize on those complaints to impose discipline. The resolution of which, of course, remains to be seen. So my friend was chastised and accused of inappropriate classroom conduct, and after two such sessions, recognized that they were being bullied, and that the bullying was happening behind closed doors, as it always had occurred. And my friend decided that was enough, and so looked up whistleblowing on their institutional website and the COT website, and decided that needed to happen. And so sent an email to select colleagues to reveal the nature of their experience that spanned a long period of time, and with the secondary purpose of ensuring that junior colleagues who had experienced the same treatment and conduct would not feel alone. And it turns out my friend was very wise, because six or seven of their colleagues confirmed similar experiences, and either have or are in the process of making complaints, lodging formal complaints. Now, this is where there's a problem, because as we know from what Hayden said, and I'm a little bit familiar with Sarah's work, the complaint processes for faculty of color or people of color are different. And I was adopted and raised in a white family, and finally, as an older adult, I finally had to kind of say to my siblings, like, you don't live in the same world I live in. We don't play by the same rules. There's different rules that apply to me than apply to you in this life. And that was a bit of a wake-up call for them. And I contend that that's a wake-up call that all colleagues, that everyone needs to understand, is that there's two sort of worlds that we live in. And if you are on one side of the color line in Canada, then it's a very different processes. So Sarah says that people of color are invisible, right? And we know this because most of us have experienced it to a certain extent. So not only are our complaints invisible, in some ways the complaint is as perceived as important as the complainer. And not only that, but also any successes are also invisible, and easily and usually dismissed. Because it wouldn't do, in a system where white supremacy reigns, it wouldn't do to have people of color being too successful. That's too uppity. And so when complaints occur, when complaints are put forward by us, there's much concern expressed about the fairness of the process, which again is really about not disrupting the status quo and white supremacy and so on. And tremendous investments in that. Then there are judgments about the complainee, or the complainant becomes the problem. And in that process, it's very difficult for those of us who have lodged complaints, because it's very harmful and painful to witness the apathy of allies, and allies, right? People who say they're allies, people who say the right thing, and academics, we often can say the right thing, very astute and keen and knowledgeable, but then in those moments where it really comes down to it, the absolute apathy and silence and refusal to act or to support or even acknowledge that there's an issue. And in that silence, they assist in the closing of ranks that institutions do so effectively. And that's sort of the institutional means of complaint dismissal. So overall, I mean, institutional processes serve to limit and restrict and frustrate complaints from faculty of color, staff of color. I think, complaint, the whole process is a means of colonial oppression. And so now I'm going to switch and talk about when complaints are lodged against us, because that's one of the avenues in which I think that colonial oppression is perpetrated, and it's unrelenting, and it's part and parcel of a racialized society, and Canada is without a doubt. So complaint is used as a tax and strategy, and then abuse of that complaint process, as in my friend's story there, is it's a tactic to destabilize and keep faculty of color in a state of disequilibrium, and and that sense of just being destabilized and lacking trust. So it's really the whole complaint, the complaint process, when it's misused, as a colonial strategy, it's a form of institutional gaslighting. And it's also the site where we experience institutional betrayal at a really profound level, on top of the betrayal of colleagues. And so, in the talk with Teaching While Black, what's her name? Gaynor Watson Creed, she was talking about institutional betrayal. And so I just took a little screenshot of one of her slides where she mentions the tropes of institutional betrayal. And this is what we'll hear, right, when we bring forth a complaint. Well, there's two sides to every story. And yet, when complaints are leveled against us, there's only one side, and that's the right side, because we're the wrong side. And another one is, this seems to be a case of you said, they said, or he said, she said, or she said, she said. And again, that's part of the fairness trope, where it's actually used against us. And well, maybe if you had been nicer. And that's something that I've heard my entire life. And part of the problem there for me was being raised by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and their Protestant work ethic, that if you just work harder and pull your socks up and be a little more friendly, then everything will work out. And it was that sort of specific message that I had to resist, and I had to disrupt in telling my siblings, we don't live in the same world. It's not, the rules are not the same for me as they are for you. Yeah, and so complaint, such an interesting thing, I must say. And really we need to, in terms of disrupting or intervention, we really need to deal with it. And we need to deal with it collectively and unrelentingly. So, my friend blew the whistle, and we have to keep blowing it. And it is my sincere hope that at some point, everyone in the country is aware of this particular incident that my friend is experiencing. Because frankly, some departments and institutions, they need they need disruption at the level of a firestorm. And for me, when I think about what would be a single most effective means of disrupting complaint when it's directed at people, faculty of color, even students of color, whomever, and it doesn't even matter if it's in academia or other institutions. The single most effective intervention would be to normalizing of video and audio recording of all meetings where unequal power holders meet, and that should become standard practice in every institution. And that easily done, easily recorded on university or stored on university servers, where departments as well as individual faculty members have their own sort of storage sites. Yeah, I could go on and on, but I know my time is limited, so I want to stop there. But thank you for the opportunity of expressing and sharing the story on behalf of my friend. They're thrilled to have this opportunity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ravian Sinclair. And now we'll be sharing some student complaints that were submitted to us. Mel and I will be taking turns reading out the complaints. The first one: conversations around Egerton Ryerson's legacy and the school name began long before any action was taken. It was not until a large number of students complained through both physical and verbal measures, taking down the statue and protesting peacefully. I think the example of X University's name change perfectly illustrates an instance where the result of complaining is positive and successful.
I'll read one as well. So, for myself and other students, complaints come from noticing how we may not fit in certain situations or be accepted in other circumstances. Specifically, I'm an African Canadian male in a sport media program made up of 85% Caucasian peers. I wonder if my voice is heard. I work hard, but do other people see my efforts? I also always talk about problems of racism in sports and in education, where we're seen as less than. I want narratives to change for myself as a Black student and changes for the benefit of my people in general. That's why complaints are important.
Another one: the institution offers a social innovation and activism fund of $20,000 for student activism and research on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. The institution wants to emphasize social justice activism. However, they also ignore the complaints of students and solely choose to focus on certain issues to paint themselves as a fair school.
And one more before we go to Allison and Heather. I'm complaining. I'm complaining about how a safe university space was infiltrated by people causing to seek harm. I'm complaining about why I must become a leader to be seen as valid in the eyes of people who want to hire me. I'm complaining about how there is a feeling that because I am taking time for myself to process and feel that I am missing out on opportunities to make myself marketable for my future. I'm complaining about how education is no longer about learning or how it purposefully excludes those who are not seen as enough in the eyes of academia. Finally, I'm complaining about how I am supposed to find community.
Thank you, Mel and Nawang. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our colleagues from the University of Winnipeg. Alison Brickey is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Winnipeg, where she teaches and writes about American literature and politics from 1850 to 1950. She has also presented and published on issues related to precarious labor in higher education, the applicability of the International Workers of the World, IWW, model of unionizing in academia, and systemic barriers for women grad students and faculty. And Heather Milne. I met Heather in, 1999, when we were both grad students at York University, and we've been good colleagues ever since. Heather Milne is a queer identified mother of a 10-year-old and an associate professor in the English department at the University of Winnipeg, where she teaches queer theory and literature, women's writing, and experimental poetics. She's the author of Poetry Matters, Neoliberalism, Affect, and the Posthuman in 21st Century North American Feminist Poetics. She's also co-director of a research project called Museum Queries that examines queer and two-spirit representation and engagement in museums. Welcome, Heather and Allison.
Thanks, Marcia. So Allison and I are going to kind of go back and forth and take turns speaking. I'm going to begin by just kind of taking you through the narrative of our complaint and what brought us to be invited to speak here this evening. Interestingly, we did not set out initially to complain, but rather to propose a solution to our university administration to a problem facing parents at our university during COVID. But our efforts did not work, and our proposed solution and invitation to collaborate with admin ended up functioning as a complaint in some ways. And Allison will speak later about all the ways that we were kind of stonewalled. So just for some background, Allison and I are two full-time faculty members in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. I'm tenured, Allison's tenure track. We're also parents of kids in the kindergarten to grade 6 age range. For the first two COVID-related school closures, we juggled full-time work as professors and our kids' remote learning to the detriment of our health and our family's well-being with no support from our employer. It's impossible to remote school your child while carrying out the duties of the job, and we were exhausted and burned out from the first two school closures. So in December, when Omicron emerged, and another school closure looked likely, Allison and I panicked because we knew that the university was going to expect us to do the impossible yet again. And we were trying to figure out how we and other working parents could continue to do our jobs if schools closed again, because it just felt impossible to juggle this again. So we tried to step in to find a solution because the university was not looking for a solution. We thought it was not feasible for the university to hire replacement teachers for us or ask our childless colleagues to pick up our teaching because they may have their own caretaking burdens or other issues, and everyone's already overworked. Nobody can take over your research because it's so specialized. Service work has to continue in order for the university to function. We concluded that the best way for the university to support working parents and to support the university community as a whole would be to find a way to take care of the remote learning angle for our kids so that we could continue to do our jobs. So we outlined a plan in a letter. We sent it to the president and vice provost, and we CC'd our faculty union. Our letter was signed by 22 professor parents from the university. We proposed that education practicum students teach our kids in small pods of 2 to 3 children, cohorted by grade level, either on campus or in our homes. This could be made safer with masks and rapid tests. We have a large faculty of education at our university. Some of these students have had practicum placements disrupted due to COVID. These students could benefit from the hands-on experience of supervising our kids' remote learning. Students could get university credit for this work, or perhaps it could just be a paid job. We also proposed as an alternative that the university advocate for post-secondary teachers to be classified as essential workers. Interestingly, we're federally classified as essential workers, but not provincially. So if we could be categorized as essential workers, we could send our kids to school. We felt that collaborating with admin on this issue could be an opportunity to develop a community of care at the university that could be beneficial to everyone. The Women's and Gender Studies Department sent a separate letter to the university president expressing their support and enthusiasm for our plan. Allison and I wanted to use our voices as tenure track and tenured faculty to advocate for a solution that would address this concern, not just for us, but also for sessionals and for support staff at the university. So the reaction from admin, the plan was rejected outright. The president said the plan to use practicum students in these roles would not be feasible. We were told to teach asynchronously and told we were lucky that our jobs were flexible compared to, quote, other sectors of the economy. It's notable that he referred to us as a sector of the economy. So essentially, we're being expected to perform the labor that makes the institution profitable economically to the detriment of ourselves and our families. So we found the university's response inadequate on many levels. First, asynchronous teaching is a lot of work. The university was suggesting we spend the day supervising our kids' remote learning and stay up late into the night recording lectures and planning classes. They were literally asking parents to do what feminist sociologists call the second shift. Second, it fails to account for the other 60% of our job, research and service. And I should note that expectations for research and service had not been adjusted at all during the pandemic. We were just expected to carry on our work as if everything was normal. Third, it failed to take into account the concerns of contract academic staff or sessionals, some of whom are teaching 4 or 5 classes, or administrative staff whose jobs are often not as flexible. They also rejected the essential worker suggestion, but they didn't provide a rationale for that. I think it's important to note that we didn't initially make a complaint. We asked for help, we proposed a solution, because after almost 2 years of a pandemic, the university had offered none, and we invited the university to work with us on this solution. But at what point is a plea for help or a proposal of a solution or an invitation to work collaboratively on a solution heard as a complaint? And I think the university definitely heard us as complaining when we were told firmly no. So I'm going to pass things over to Allison now.
Great, thanks, Heather. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we learned about our institution from coming up against what Ahmed calls the wear and tear. So I would say ultimately we came up against 3 solid walls that at first looked like possible doors, to use Ahmed's architectural terms. There was first the initial dismissal of our proposal by the university president that Heather was talking about. This was very disheartening, as we had hoped it would open more discussion. So then I decided to approach our faculty unions, since it seemed that this was the very definition of a labor and equity issue. When I approached our union council, however, and I also sit on union council as a member at large, it soon became clear that no substantial help would come from them. So what we needed here was collective mobilization that would now persuade the administration to make this a priority. We had just seen what the union could accomplish when we mobilized in the summer to push the university to adopt a vaccine mandate with a 99% membership vote. This was something that the university administration had previously said they would absolutely not do. However, I was given the impression repeatedly by the union that this kind of mobilization wasn't needed or possible here. I was assured that there were closed door conversations happening with admin on this issue, and that any further collective action would not be advantageous or necessary. Something to think about, I think, at this point for me is the role that unions currently play and could play within post-secondary institutions. So many university unions are structured as business unions instead of social or revolutionary unions. So this is fundamentally the difference between a union that mimics the structure of the business or corporation in which it is nested. So it's hierarchical, it's top down, and the lines of solidarity that are fostered are often only between members of the same rank. Social unions, however, run from the bottom up or the factory floor up. They foster solidarity between workers of distinct ranks and crafts or trades, and they will connect its workers' concerns with larger social justice movements like anti-racism, feminism, and environmentalism. You can find this kind of unionism not normally in the university, but in the bargaining for the common good movement or the IWW or one big union model of organizing. The problem with business unions is that they risk becoming petrified within the rigid institutional structure of the university itself. This makes real change and progress very difficult to achieve. The collective agreement becomes the only imagined means of progress within very strictly controlled and narrow definitions of correct collective bargaining issues. And there can be a kind of anticipatory empathy that the union develops in relation to the financial and institutional concerns of upper administration. So the union's gaze essentially will constantly be fixed above itself instead of being attentive to what is happening below. This often takes the form of the repeated articulation of mutually shared goals between workers and admin that can elide real institutional power imbalances and inequities that nonetheless persist. So concerns like Heather and I were raising become in some important sense unhearable within this framework. Our collective agreement had no mention of anything that could help us in this scenario. And this is also importantly partially how the adjunct crisis has been able to thrive within universities whose faculty espouse often ostensibly progressive values. So while unions, because of their history, can often be automatically assumed to be progressive, feminist, leftist organizations on paper, and here I'm thinking of Ahmed's really excellent critique of paper feminists, as she calls them. In practice, we have to admit that they are also vulnerable to being used as a tool that the institution itself can mobilize to prevent complaint in the guise of addressing it. This can look like, we are meeting with the union, we have met with the union. So I would say that was our second wall, and it was a very disappointing wall. The third wall that we came up against was University Senate. So we raised this issue in University Senate. This is supposedly the heart of university collegial governance. However, when we voiced our concerns there, the president actually took our articulation of our concerns as an opportunity to invoke our proposal as quote unquote interesting in order to publicly dismiss it as unfeasible. So our complaint was then stuck in three places: the administration, the union, and the Senate, all places that in some fundamental sense purport to be open to hearing complaint. I'll pass it back to Heather now.
Give me a minute to unmute there. Okay, so one of the discussion prompts that we were given to prepare for this was, how has your complaint led to other folks with complaints, and can we collectivize complaint? So I want to say that although Allison and I led this initiative, the 22 signatories of the letter formed a sort of collective. The letter was a collective endeavor. We had input on the letter from many of the signatories and a vibrant discussion over email. We were able to connect people across ranks and across faculties, which is structurally discouraged by the university. The university likes to separate us out by what they call rank: full professor, associate professor, assistant professor, sessionals, admin staff. And we wanted to find a way to voice collective concerns that united us all as working parents. It's important to note that all 22 signatories were tenured or tenure track, but this is because others felt like they couldn't put their name on the letter for fear of recrimination, which itself suggests that the letter was perceived as a form of complaint in some ways. There were others who approached us quietly, administrative support staff in particular, who were afraid to speak publicly, but who came to us with their fears and concerns. One person had serious concerns about how front-facing admin staff were being treated in relation to the pandemic, but they had been told that if they speak out, they could be fired for insubordination. So although this person supported the letter, they did not feel like they could sign it. We think of these people as silent members of our complaint collective, and we want to use our institutional privilege to advocate for them as well as for ourselves. We also created a Slack channel of parents and non-parents communicating about labor issues in relation to COVID. We started this back in summer when we were pushing for vaccine and mask mandates, but then did it again in December and January in relation to the action around our letter. We would be interested in forming a national complaint collective on this matter, maybe through CAUT, because as far as we know, universities across the country have done nothing to support parents through the school closures during COVID. Some of us have complained together on social media, but this issue has really shown across Canada how universities have failed their employers and their employees, and particularly those employees who are parents during the pandemic. Allison, I'll pass it over to you for our final remarks.
So we thought we should talk a little bit about media, since this is a media activist center. So we were not very successful in this regard, but we were quite vocal on social media, as Heather mentioned. And we actually did contact larger media outlets several times about this issue, but they just weren't interested in picking up the story at all. I also happen to serve as the chair of the daycare board where my daughter goes to daycare. And through that role, I was connected to a local journalist who was interested in talking to working parents who were facing the difficulties of these school shutdowns. So I did do an interview with him, but he was mostly interested in hearing a critique of the provincial government's pandemic policies that led to this shutdown, rather than anything about my individual employer. So while I did take the opportunity in the interview to talk about our letter and the failure of our university to put any supports in place for us, that piece was actually edited out in the final version. So part of the issue also, right, is that the general public has a limited picture of what we do, and any complaining that we do about our working conditions are not often taken seriously because they are viewed as coming from within an elitist and isolated ivory tower. Not only does the stereotype of the cushy professor job obscure the labor conditions of precarious workers all across Canadian post-secondary institutions, as well as grad students, right? Labor conditions which are increasingly becoming the norm, but it also disadvantages those workers who face work-life challenges that the stereotypical cisgendered white man professor didn't historically face. So we know that women still do the majority of childcare statistically, and it is simply misogynist to expect them to pick up the burden of childcare and homeschooling and continue performing academic labor as though nothing has changed. I was thinking as I was rereading Ahmed's book for this event about how close the word compliant is to complaint, just a small vowel change. And I think in the end, what we were refusing to do was to stay compliant for a third time, to refuse compliance. And the only way the university could hear that refusal, as Heather mentioned, was as a complaint. What's so frustrating is that we were being asked to silently consent to a major and detrimental shift in our working conditions that was not sustainable and could result in real burnout and harm if we kept it up for too long. Our refusal to comply to that unreasonable demand is what triggered all of these walls that came up and doors that were shut. But I'm grateful in a way because I can now see the contours of those barriers so much more sharply than I could before, and that's valuable. And as Ahmed reminds us, frustration can be a feminist record. Watch out, we have the data. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you both Heather and Allison for that. All right, so last round of complaints. Here's the first one. As a student experiencing my education through a global pandemic, it is unfair for me to pay my full tuition as if the classes were offered in person. I and various students have been outspoken about this topic and continuously complain about this issue to the university through various media platforms and primarily social media. The institution, on the other hand, continues to turn a blind eye to our complaints and continuously charges students with a tuition fee of that in person and on campus. The institution uses the excess charge of tuition to push its ideas of expanding the business resources and relations of its students to prepare them for the workforce after leaving the institution. However, due to the pandemic, these resources are not as accessible, which counteracts the institution's plans. The university as a public institution should use its resources from expensive tuition fees to ensure that they are not profiting from the decline of the economy and of the mental health of its students.
Even though it has been many months since the school went from Ryerson University to X University, we can see that the complaint is an effective shift with the support of the public. As an Indigenous student at the university, this was a very large part of my family's history that resurfaced as they watched in the news the numbers of the graves found on the lands. I know that without the complaints and support from the community, there would be no change or shift in stopping how the system works.
I have had issues with the system when it came to seeking help regarding my mental health concerns in both high school and university. I find that many institutions claim to be supportive of those suffering with debilitating mental illnesses, but that the process to acquire this support is rather counterproductive. As someone who struggles with my mental health on a regular basis, the countless amount of paperwork and meetings that I had to endure in order for my voice to be heard only added to my stress and anxieties. I have contemplated complaining about this process to the university, but I find myself questioning whether all the time and effort it takes to be heard is really worth it. This is a major flaw in the system that I strongly believe needs to be resolved. And that's the last of the complaints from the students. Thank you so much for the students who have submitted their complaints. And now I'd like to introduce our final speaker of the night, Amber Grant. Amber is the former chief steward for QPA Local 3904 Unit 3, which represents academic assistants at X University. Amber is an active member of the Unit 3 bargaining team, where they and their team just finished negotiating a new deal for academic assistance under the restrictions of Bill 124. In addition to their experience organizing around workers' rights, Amber has years of experience working in student politics, where they helped to create the first and only graduate students union at X University. Welcome, Amber.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. And yeah, thank you everyone who came before me as well. Thanks Nwang for the introduction and the organizers of this event. The speakers so far have been incredible, and I just want to thank everyone for sharing their wisdom and knowledge with all of us today. And I also want to thank Sarah Ahmed as well, as her work has really inspired much of what I hope to share today. Before we get started, just want to first just define what a labor union is. I've noticed through my work that at least the folks that I work with don't often know what a labor union is. So it's a group of organized folks who are united to make decisions about conditions affecting their work. They function somewhat, are supposed to function like a democracy. So they hold elections where the members of the union elect officers to make decisions on their behalf. And it is the responsibility of those elected officials to make decisions appropriately based on member needs. Labor unions work with employers to negotiate what is known as a collective agreement. So a collective agreement is a legal written contract that outlines the working conditions, the benefits, and the complaint processes between an employer and a union. And oftentimes these complaint processes are outlined in collective agreements as like a grievance process or as a dispute resolution process. And labor unions are also a place to then therefore make formalized complaints. And these complaints can be individual, so it could be a member grievance, or it could be a collective complaint. So either through the form of a group grievance or through the bargaining unit when a new collective agreement is being negotiated. And so generally speaking, the process of filing a complaint can be quite inaccessible. It can be quite lengthy, and it can be very intimidating, especially if you're part of a union like the one that I am a part of, where many of us have never been a part of a union before. We're students, we're precarious workers, and we might not have all the information that we need in order to kind of formalize that complaint. And this is an old photo here of me as the chief, when I was the chief steward, working in solidarity with the students union, doing some action around student labor rights at X University. Talks about how policies and procedures at university are often inaccessible, and she talks about how this is deliberate to help ensure that complaints stay with the complainer and that doors stay closed. And in the context of my work in bargaining, this is certainly the norm. Despite our collective agreement outlining that, for example, the union gets 30 minutes a semester to speak with its members at the faculty level, only one faculty at our university provides us with this 30 minutes. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, it's the Ted Rogers School of Management, so the business school on campus, which is interesting. And what this means is that members often don't know that they're part of a union. They have difficult time accessing information about the union. They might not know what types of benefits then they have if they don't know which union they're a part of. Or that their position is unionized. And so the only way to really communicate with our members actually boils down to, especially during the pandemic, is through email. And another note on the inaccessibility of policies and procedures as well is during the bargaining process, or what the bargaining process entails, is kind of reflecting on all the instances where members made complaints to the union, and we reflect on those and we try to shape our proposals to the employer based on what those complaints were. And one of the issues that came up is that this exact issue. So members were complaining, for example, when they experienced issues of harassment or discrimination, they weren't sure where to go. And this was especially the case around sexual violence. And so part of our proposals was to recommend to the employer that these policies and procedures be clearly outlined in the collective agreement, or at the very least that a link be provided for our members, so the members could then access a digital copy of the collective agreement and link to the policies and procedures that the university has outlined if, for example, discrimination or sexual violence were to be faced by a member. And the university rejected our proposal and held strong on that, saying that the policies and procedures are clearly outlined on the university website, and that if members have problems, they should essentially look through the university website to resolve that. And so we were unsuccessful in achieving that proposal. So to me, this just suggests, the perpetuation of the university kind of making this intentionally an inaccessible process for both students and who are also members and employees at the university. Ahmed also talks about complaints as a warning sign, or a complaint as a warning sign. She talks about how complaints can be stopped through the use of warnings. And she mentions that when she interviews students, they often talk about how if they're to make a complaint, that they're jeopardizing their future career goals, that there's this large risk involved with going forward with making a complaint. And again, as chief steward, that's certainly, again, the norm. On a weekly basis, I would have members disclose issues of unfair working conditions, not getting enough hours to do their work in their contracts, being overworked, not given a rubric to do their grading, being asked to do duties outside of the collective agreement, like fetch their professor's coffee, or in some cases their laundry. And I would also hear more tragic stories as well of experiences where members were experiencing gender and racial discrimination as well. And while these were less, this happened on not as often of a basis as the other kind of weekly issues that I dealt with, this was still it happened way too often, and particularly from women working in STEM as well as international students. And unfortunately, the academic culture of individualism and competition make members who are also graduate students feel like they can participate in a formal complaint process. And so many of these issues with the union would just be swept under the rug. Members would plead with us, I want to share this with you, but please don't tell anyone, I'm going to lose my job, or, I'll never get hired in this department again if you say anything, or I'll lose my student visa if someone were to know about this, so please don't say anything. And so, like Ahmed says, being told not to complain is often seen as career advice. Complaining is viewed as self-damage or damage to others. And so the union in this case also then plays a role in gatekeeping. And it's something to be critical of. It's complicated because then we enter a stage of, usually it doesn't come out until enough people have made a complaint almost, or, confidentiality turns into anonymity, and we have to disclose essentially what our members are dealing with in order to go through some sort of grieving process. Ahmed also talks about exhaustion as a management technique. She talks about how universities will make the process of complaining so exhausting that people will break down, or that they won't move forward in the complaint process. And this is true for unions. And in terms of the bargaining process itself, it's actually designed to break people. For those who don't know what bargaining is, we sit in meetings anywhere from as short as 2 hours to as long as 8 hours would probably be the norm, but sometimes it can be a 12, 13, 14 hour long meeting that we're sitting in the same room going back and forth and sharing proposals. The meetings aren't designed to be fun. They're designed to break the spirit of people, and arguably the most precarious workers in the room. And because we're being paid, about minimum wage to sit there and represent our members. Oftentimes, unions also have their own bylaws where once a bargaining team has been paid a certain amount of money, they stop paying them. So a lot of the time, bargaining reps end up doing this work for free. But these meetings are intentional. They're designed to force people into making decisions quickly, and they're designed to leave complaints behind. And so for our bargaining that recently just finished, we ratified our agreement yesterday evening. We spent a collective, between the three of us on the bargaining team, 565 hours at the table, creating and exchanging proposals over the last 8 months. And also the university's favorite way to deal with complaints is to form a committee. That's, lots of jokes around creating committees, but committees as, it's a great way to kind of delay the complaint process. Part of what we won is the a health benefits working group committee to address the lack of health benefits for TAs and GAs. And this meant that the university would provide us with things like data on health benefit usage, and that they would provide us with information about different quotes from insurers based on health plans that the union was designing with its members. But every time we would get to the meeting, and I tell you, every single time, myself and my team of volunteers would arrive, and the employer would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we forgot which one of us was supposed to get that quote for you, so we don't have it." Or, "Oh, I'm sorry, I totally forgot. What was the data you requested? What was that data that you needed?" And so we would get our free sandwich lunch. That was the incentive. And then we would, schedule a meeting a month later, and we would continue this process. And eventually I ended up just getting so frustrated that I actually just started doing the work myself. I started getting insurance quotes. I started making relationships with different students' unions to help mobilize to try and get a comprehensive health benefits plan. And since then, we've stopped having those meetings. That committee kind of dissolved naturally. And so the employer never held true on its promise to deliver the bare minimum on that committee, unfortunately. I also want to acknowledge, much like Allison was saying as well, that there are problems with unions. And I'll say, like, one of the reasons why I left working in a union was because of the internal politics. There's a variety of different folks who work in unions who have different, mindsets about how unions should be run and what should be prioritized. And so, in the context of complaints, labor unions, they work against the complainer as well. And so, for example, if a student is to make a complaint against a unionized staff member, it's the union's legal duty to represent their member at all costs. And so, even if you might morally, as a union rep, agree with what the student is complaining about, you have a legal responsibility, a legal duty to represent the member. And so what that means is, if a student were to make a complaint about, experiences of racism or sexual violence, the union would use the exact same tactics that the institution uses to silence the union and its members, but this time the union would be doing the silencing to the complainer. And Ahmed talks about this as placating the complainer, as making less of the situation. It might look like, we recommend as a union that we, have a space where the complainer get together with, the member who is being accused, and provide a space for them to, voice their concerns, try to come to an agreement. And that would be part of a prolonged complaint process that would discourage the complainer from, again, moving forward with their complaint. The one positive scenario to this is that, it's really complicated, and I'll highlight that, is just that at the very least, the union is taking notes of when issues like this happen. And so on the instance of sexual violence, this was something that was really important to me and really frustrated me as well when I was chief steward. But we have no training for our members on sexual violence. And so they don't know what the sexual violence policy is at the university. And so when we hear students making these complaints against members, which unfortunately is more often than you think, we're advocating then in collective bargaining to make these changes, to pay people to take mandatory sexual violence training, so things like the complainer situation isn't happening anymore. Complicated issue, but something to raise. And I also just want to say one last thing here is that complaints are personal, and Ahmed talks about how complaints is personal, and that it's often seen as self-promotion, and that the complainer is often someone who is selfish. And I'm really not doing justice to how she talks about this, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll leave it at that. And so I kind of want to end on a personal story about myself making a complaint through the bargaining process, and perhaps like a slightly different, not so much a formalized complaint, but an issue of complaint and conflict. Like I've said, my bargaining team and I just finished bargaining with the employer, and we have a new ratified collective agreement until December 2023. But bargaining wasn't easy. We were subjected to Doug Ford's Bill 124, which means we cannot raise wages and total compensation beyond 1%. And we're also tasked with working with the new chief negotiator, who is new to the university and new to labor relations, did not have the history of what our local bargaining unit was dealing with. And so tensions became so tough between after many months that we had to file for conciliation. We had a conciliator present for the last couple of months of our bargaining process, and we were just days away from heading into a strike vote. Actually, the strike vote would have been this Friday had we not come to an agreement this week. And so we are getting close to going on strike, and that would have been tricky for professors who rely on TAs and GAs. And I always had an issue with this chief negotiator for a number of reasons, but for the sake of time, I'll just talk about one story. Outside of the labor union, I work as a graduate writing consultant. I help graduate students with their research and their writing. And what comes with that is a lot of personal and emotional support as well. Obviously, going through grad school is tough. And so a lot of graduate students will come to us with voicing their challenges, and we often become peers and friends to those who book appointments with us. And I love my job. I've been doing it for coming on to 6 years now, so it's been a while. It's a hard job, but I have a lot of responsibility. And unfortunately, our department is heavily underfunded, and so each year our director thinks about ways to cut costs and save money. And one of her proposals was to hire undergraduate students through what's called a career boost position to replace graduate students because we're paid too high, in her opinion, where our wages are too high. And so when I was steward, I filed a complaint with the university. We won that. We were told that they were going to leave our positions and they weren't going to hire undergrads to replace us. However, then we got into bargaining, and the chief negotiator brought this up again as an idea. And he decided to pitch a concession to us, which means reduction in wages. And he pitched a concession of $15 an hour for all employees working in my department. And to quote him verbatim, he said, "We're proposing this change because we believe that this wage is more in line with the type of work that you and the others in your department are doing." And he directed his comment at me. And so I took great offense. I felt sick to my stomach. And I kind of bit back. And when I bite back, I'm always calm. But internally, I'm shaking a little bit. And, I told him that his suggestion was offensive and it was insulting. I asked him that he should try doing my job. I told him that he probably couldn't do my job. And I asked him how he knew what type of work I do. I asked him who he spoke to about the type of work that I do. And he responded and said, "I haven't done enough research. I'll come back to you." And then a week later, he decided to withdraw his concession without prejudice and didn't bring it up again. To complain for me felt like I was being selfish, as Ahmed says. It felt like I was centering myself as an employee there. It felt like others in the room might perceive me to be like I'm not upholding my duties as a union representative to center the needs of others. But then I remembered that the union's role is to collectivize the complaint. If we agreed to this concession, which we never would have done, that also opens the door for more concessions. It opens the door to the employer pitching to us no raises. It sends a message to our members that their work isn't valued, and it sends a message to our members that the union's not listening. But they are listening. And your current chief steward is incredible. I never would have stepped down if, honestly, if I'm being hyper transparent, if he didn't step into power. But Michael Frischetti is incredible. If you haven't met him yet, and you're a Unit 3 employee who's here tonight, strongly recommend you connect with them. And I want to just leave on a quick message as well. Ahmed says that complaint can teach us how a university is built, and complaint is about what is going on within a university. And so I'll say, on the note of unions, talk to your union, get involved, be the complainer, and let the union do its job in complaining for you. I'll say that those who are involved with 3904 Unit 3 in particular seriously have your back and want to support the complainers for real. That's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Amber. And thank you to all of our panelists. We want to open up for questions now. So if anyone has a question, if you can write it in the chat. I've learned so much. We've heard about the colonial rhetoric of renaming, racist surveillance of BIPOC faculty, silence as complaint dismissal, the conditions of faculty who are mothers, the attempt to build a community of care, the problem of the business union, the technology of the labor union, the inaccessibility of policies and procedures, and also solutions, the normalizing of recording of meetings, community involvement, a nationwide community of care for faculty who are parents, appropriate wages for union staff. So we are able to leave this with such a sense of hope for the work that you all are doing that I'm so grateful for. Nawang will start us off with a question, and then we'll open it up to our audience.
Thank you, everybody. I have so much to process, but I guess one of the things that I am wondering about is how, and this could be like a personal, I guess, question, but how do you kind of cope with when you do complain and it's not received the way that you hope? So yeah, I'm just wondering, what are your kind of coping mechanisms when you're caught in a place where you're disappointed by the response that you get from whatever institution or person or employer that you're working for?
Who is this directed to?
Anybody, anyone can jump
Okay.
in. Yeah.
So I can put in my 2 cents at this point. I've practiced Miguel Ruiz's 4 Agreements for the last 20 years since the book came out, and I have to say that it's served me well. The agreement that says don't take anything personally. What others say and do is a reflection of their reality, not yours. I am so grateful for that, that teaching and for practicing it, because I'm able to sit in very, very difficult meetings and remain absolutely calm, and recognize that anything that's thrown at me, and it doesn't matter whether it's in a falsely kind tone, or if it's an accusation from a person who's shaking with anger. I don't take it personally. I do give myself space to just breathe. And what that does is it really helps me to focus on the issues rather than personalities. Because with the process being so challenging, if we're the complainer, I mean, we're labeled, and then the processes are insurmountable, as Amber was saying, and just all of the frustrations in place, seeing your colleagues that you thought had your back just sort of fall by the wayside, and so on. It's easy to go down that road of anguish and rage and grief, and we have to recognize that there's a very fine line between righteous rage, that sort of keeps us focused on the issues, and then retaliatory rage, because it's a really fine line. And if we go into a meeting with having slipped sort of past out of righteous rage, then that's where we sort of put ourselves at risk of being angry, not being able to be calm, express ourselves, and so on. And again, it's sort of a more of a burden on the complainer, because you're the reason you're complaining is because things are not tenable. The situations are, they're horrible, they're terrible, and yet you're then required to be respectful and calm, and you know, and, you know, that's enough to make you want to sort of flip out as well and just, you know, sort of like run amok. But you can't, right? You can't. So that practice is really, really important. And for me, again, the essential piece is that, you know, I will go off and I'll do my own personal work. Like I'll grieve, I'll cry at the triggers. You know, I'll grieve that things haven't changed for so many years. Like, you know, and people are experiencing this across the country and so on, and not just in academia, but in other contexts. And young people are suffering and taking their lives because of racism and so on. And it's like, I have to do that work because then it frees me to again focus on what's the core issues here. And you know, for me, like I'm a full professor and tenured, and so you know, it's a privilege, and so, you know, I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to do what I can when I can, you know, and when I know that there's things that are going on that just are not acceptable. Yeah, so it's a big responsibility, but we can do it. And you know, I'm in this for the long haul. So yeah.
Does anyone else want to respond to Nawang's question?
I mean, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Heather. Okay. I was just gonna say, like, I agree. And yeah, for me, like, I don't really accept no as an answer, but that's just kind of like my personality as well. So at least like speaking from like my union perspective, I have, you know, like a calm demeanor, but tend to be someone who, you know, isn't afraid to call people out, call people in the administration when they're doing things that are wrong. So yeah, that's just me. No is not an answer.
I think for me, with our complaint, you know, I'd been getting increasingly kind of pissed off at my university administration as the pandemic kind of dragged on, and there was radio silence from them on a lot of things. And you know, I was sort of sitting there thinking, well, you know, I can be upset, or I can try to propose a solution, or I could think of something. But I wasn't surprised when they just said no. I kind of expected that. I mean, I was disappointed, but I also kind of expected it. But what I didn't expect was just the slamming of the door, like the no sort of invitation to sit down and figure out a solution. I did expect that they might say, "Oh, we can't use practicum students, but let's figure out what we can do and what would meaningful support look like for parents working right now." So it was disappointing, but it wasn't a surprise. But I think what was positive that came out of it was, I mean, it was fun to work up with Allison on this, and it was fun to, I think, reach out and connect with other faculty members, because we've all been kind of working in isolation, but having similar struggles. And so it did feel like a collective endeavor, and that was nice. And it felt, yeah, I guess it felt good to forge those kinds of connections. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have one question from the audience here. I'm just going to read it out loud. I'm interested to hear the panelists' takes on tenure, especially as it relates to the business union, precarity, and the protection of those who are complained against. Could tenure be compatible with an institution better attuned to hearing and acting on complaints? Who would like?
I can answer that. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I'm of the view that we shouldn't abolish tenure, that we should expand it, that everybody needs job security and that everybody needs good working conditions. And on what comes along with job security. And I think some of the complexities that Amber spoke so eloquently about are that sometimes unions end up serving the interests of those who are protected against legitimate complaints. So I think that that is something that needs to be addressed, but job security is something that allows people to complain also. And it's something that, you know, the fear of you know, losing one's contract, job, you know, the rumor mill, those are all very real things. I've had people say to me like, stop complaining, you don't have tenure yet, you know, and this is way worse for my colleagues who are precarious, and it's way worse for students. So the power dynamics in the institution are designed to prevent those kinds of complaints from being heard. So I think if we can expand the job security rather than take it away from the privileged few who have it, I think that's better in my opinion.
Does anyone else want to respond to that? Thank you, Allison. I'm going to ask a question. I was interested in Hayden's outlining of the process of, you know, what finally got the statue removed and what finally got the name change happening. And it seemed that it wasn't until the outside community provoked the university that that complaint, as what he called complaint as consensus, process, dialogue, and provocation happened. So my question is, how do we, or should we, mobilize our complaints outside of the university? And I think Allison and Heather, you spoke to that a little bit, but is that the best way to collectivize our complaint? Is that, you know, part of our toolkit of strategy?
I can sort of answer that. Yes, I think we should mobilize our complaints outside the university. And part of doing that, I think, is communicating, finding ways to communicate what the university is, or, you know, what it is that we're doing, or, you know, why that statue should be removed, or why the university's name should be changed, or, you know, why academic parents are struggling, or, you know, why TAs need better working conditions, like, or RAs, sessionals. These are things that we have to do, I think, a better job of getting people to understand why those things are relevant. Because I think the university can be mysterious. It can operate in these insular ways. And we need to do a better job of that kind of communication.
Does anyone else want to speak to that? And Raven, I was very intrigued by your diagnosis of the university as having antisocial personality disorder, if I got that right. An ego deficits mixed with power. I wonder if you can expand on that, or or suggest a remedy for the personality disorder.
Yeah, so I wasn't so much diagnosing institutions, although, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Although, you know, the institution is made up of individuals, and I don't want to sort of paint all individuals with the same brush, because there's some pretty awesome people that work in institutions, whether they're academic or not non-academic. I'm thinking about, you know, someone mentioned, you know, that we're sort of untangling the nuances and motivations and so on. And so, you know, these are the things that I think about is, you know, why do people do these things? Why do they abuse power? You know, why do groups of students go after faculty of color and women at a you know, disproportionate rate, with frivolous complaints and so on? And you know, when I think about when I think about people in leadership who abuse power, it intrigues me. I'm curious because you work for all these years, you go through your different degrees, and then you acquire a position to what, isolate people and berate them behind closed doors. To what end, to what purpose? And sometimes, I don't understand it. And so, I have been looking at, I do have a psych degree, but it's been a while since I've, taken a look at the literature and got caught up to date on things like personality disorders. So I was fairly recently looking at some of the information, and because there's very little difference, I think, between a domestic abuser and someone who has power in an institution who is also an abuser. I mean, the actions, the conduct, the symptoms are all the same, and yeah, so we don't need to sort of go beyond. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that's really any different, other than the individual does have institutional power, which probably makes them even more dangerous because they can mess with your career. And so yeah, I mean, I think I just brought it up because it was something that I have been, I've been thinking about, reflecting on, and it helps me to understand. I mean, again, my goal is about not taking it personally, and so I want to, understand this person a little bit more, because as odd as it sounds, if I can understand people, and that they're acting out of maybe an array of ego deficits, and usually that's involved somehow. It's that desire to acquire power and buffer up a damaged self-esteem or ego. If I can understand, then I actually feel more compassion. And it's, when I can get to that place of compassion, I know I'm not taking it personally. And I know that I'm, really striving to understand this person, and then through it, I can see their humanity, and acknowledge that they're flawed. I have some flaws, probably not quite as big, but it's one of those sort of paradoxes in life that if I can sit with someone knowing that they absolutely want to crush me or just hate me, it's really got nothing to do with me. And from that perspective, I can look at their actions, their conduct, their behavior, and actually feel compassion. Because what a place to be in, to engage with another human being that way, in such a destructive manner. And and how awful it must be that I don't respond.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Makes me think of a Buddhist idea to, when someone wrongs you, to think, thank you for showing me how not to be.
Exactly. Yeah, I was listening to a Black educator from the States, and I mean, she was just amazing. And I can't remember her name. I got to find it again on YouTube, but I was just going down the YouTube rabbit hole. And so she's an anti-racism educator. And she said that, she's done tremendous work, personal work, as well as, theoretical work in the area of anti-racism. And she said, because of the work that I've done personally, it's a responsibility I have. I've stood in front of people who have just spewed vitriol at me, like racist vitriol. And my only thought is, nothing you can say is going to make me love you any less. And I thought, holy crap, I'm not there yet. But that's really, it's profound. Yeah, I think that's the path I'm heading down. But yeah, that's profound.
Thank you. There's one last question from the audience, and this is for anyone on the panel. When complaints are unfounded or based on partial information, this can create harm and undermine trust, especially if there's already a culture of distrust. And when racism and other injustices happened in the past, complaints can jump to conclusions due to previous harm. How do you bring people into the circle in these cases? which I read to mean how do we continue to create community in the face of injustice? It's a big question.
I'll just quickly mention that it sounds like it's drawing or it's speaking to resentment. And interestingly enough, that's also part of ego deficits, is that perceived wrongs. People with antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder will hang on to those for years and years and years and years and years and years and seek an opportunity to try to rectify them. And again, if they're in a position of power, that's disastrous. Yeah. So how do we? Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, one way is, make sure everybody gets the therapy they need, but that's, a little bit utopian. I'm thinking more in terms of, my suggestion about normalizing the recording, audio, video recording of any meetings where there's a power differential and, across the academy. That's going to do a lot to nip academic bullying in, and abuse. It's just gonna, I think it's would go a tremendous way in just dealing with it and making it impossible, because that's my goal, right? My goal is to make it impossible for abuse of power to take place in institutions, or at least as much as we can. Yeah, so starting with institutional policies and procedures rather than people, because people, if people realize that they're sort of stepping out of line in terms of collective agreements and policies and so on, sometimes that's that's powerful in terms of requiring people to correct their own behavior. Yeah. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Does anyone else want to speak to that? Well, on that note, I'll pass it over to Nawang to close our event. And thank you so much. This was really amazing, all of you.
Thank you, everybody, for staying with us another 10 minutes. Just wanted to thank you all for attending tonight's event. Thank you to all the student complainers. Thank you to our brilliant panelists and our small but mighty SMACS team for making this event possible. Just a reminder again to donate to Wet'suwet'en Defense if you can. The link is in the chat. And I hope to see you at our next event at Glad Day Bookshop for Lab of Feminist Memory. And yeah, thank you everybody again. Good night.